So we are concluding our series, To Us a Son is Given, and looking specifically at Jesus as the Son of God. And I would like to register a bit of a complaint publicly. Jesus as the Son of God is a very complicated topic. Because Jesus as the Son of God dips into so many different aspects of the Bible and theology and what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a human being, that it is almost impossible to pull something together in 20 minutes. But we're going to try. And to give you an example of why this is so complicated, I'll tell a little bit about me. And that is, when I was in my 20s, more or less. It hasn't happened in a little while. For whatever reason, whenever I was out and about, and there were people who were aggressively evangelizing people by coming up and bothering them and asking them complicated questions about their life, they would almost inevitably come to me. Apparently, when I was younger, I just looked like I really needed Jesus or something like that. And for the record, I do need Jesus, but I already know him. I guess now I look older, I look more like a dad, so they leave me alone. But I don't necessarily love that style of evangelism, to put it mildly, and especially how they would start some of these conversations. And in particular, it happened a couple of times, they would come up and ask, hey, sir, do you believe in God? Now, interestingly enough, my response to them, which is my real response, is not yes. My response is always, what do you mean by God? Because when you use the word God, it's this thing where you assume that the other person understands what you're thinking about God. So if I say the word God, I've got this kind of image or this idea, and I automatically assume that's what you think and that's what you hear when I say God, and vice versa. And that means that it's very easy to miscommunicate. Because there are lots of different ways that you can describe God. You could say that God is like this angry dude with a beard in the sky, and he looks down and he sees most of humanity being really naughty, and he can't wait to send them all to hell. Or God is in all of us and we are all part of God. Or God is in creation and in nature, and nature is in God. Or God is this force or this being that started off the universe but tends to kind of keep out of it and let it run through natural processes or something like that. Those are all different ways to talk about God, but none of those descriptions actually describe the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is much different. And to make things even more complicated and weird, we have to recognize that when we use the word God, we are referring to that which cannot be described or encapsulated by a word or a concept. God is beyond whatever that might be. Again, talking about Jesus as the Son of God is very complicated. So, we're going to use the first 14 verses of John, you just heard it read, and I'm going to go back through them, and we're going to ask how what John is saying will tell us or help us understand what we mean when we use the word God. So John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now it's obvious what John is talking about, so we can just skip ahead, right? No. John, with the way John writes, whenever I read John deeply, I find myself saying, there's a bunch here that I'm supposed to get, and I do not get it. And that has to do with, in part, how John is writing. He likes to hint and suggest. And so when we break it down, I think it'll make a little more sense. he starts it off with "in the beginning," and he talks about creation. And so if you're an astute Bible reader, you would recognize that and go back to the very beginning of the Bible itself. The Bible begins with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," which helps us start to answer our question, what do we mean by God? God creates out of nothing. So if you create out of nothing, you are by definition God. And however, the story doesn't end there. And I think John kind of has this in mind, and he kind of weaves these ideas throughout, and he expects you to know what this all means. Because it's not that God just kind of created heavens and earth and got everything started and then walked away. That's deism, as it turns out. But that the Bible starts with God creating over a period of 7 days. And on that seventh day, God rests. And it's not because God got tired and wanted a beer and wanted to sit by the pool or something like that. But in an ancient Hebrew world, for God to rest means that God is taking up residence. He is moving in. His presence is coming to his creation. So what do we mean when we say God? Well, first, God creates. But second, God is invested in that creation. Now, there's another story of creation, and the way I read it, they're sequential. God starts to do something else. He forms a garden that is designated sacred space, and it's a place where his presence resides. And he puts these two humans there. Eventually, it starts with one. And he gives them the task of being his image bearer, to work and to keep this sacred space. They reflect him. They're his ambassadors. And he tells them not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we've talked about this off and on over the last year or two. The knowledge of good and evil is a good thing. It's not that God said, hey, there's an apple tree over there, and because I have this divine vendetta against apples, don't you dare touch it. But the knowledge of good and evil is wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to see a choice and recognize which is good and which is evil. We all ought to have the knowledge of good and evil. But these human beings, selected to represent God, grasp wisdom for themselves. And then God's good creation is disrupted. And that is a brilliant insight into human nature, how much human suffering is the product of us defining wisdom or good and evil for ourselves. Because whenever I define good or evil for myself, it tends to be extremely selfish, and I will disrupt or destroy myself and those around me given a long enough timeline. And at that point, God's presence it leaves his creation, but there's this sense that he is still interested in what happens. And so the question then lingers throughout the Bible is, how does God's presence return? So not only is God creator, but he's invested in creation. He has this sense of wisdom, but then that creation gets disrupted when his creation decides they know better and they're going to choose what's good and evil. Now, interestingly enough, the New Testament writers are operating in a world with all kinds of other ideas. It's not that the Old Testament was written and then for 400 years nothing happened and nobody thought about this stuff, and then suddenly the New Testament comes. And it's very useful to look at some of the other Jewish writing around the time of Jesus, because you can start to see or hear echoes of what they're saying in the New Testament. So this is from the Wisdom of Solomon. This is not scripture. It's not inspired by God or anything. But it says, O God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, you have made all things by your word. and by your wisdom have formed humankind. Well, remember what John said. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in a very complicated way, he says, everything was made by this Word. Now, spoiler alert, that Word is Jesus, which means that Jesus is the Word which God spoke to create the universe. And an ancient Hebrew would not necessarily separate somebody and their word. That those were all kind of like a unified thing. So Jesus is this word that was spoken to create the universe. And then this writer of wisdom, this is all just underneath the surface of the New Testament, especially Paul. He says, and by your wisdom you have formed humankind. See, the ancient Jews, and this very much is reflected in the New Testament, realized that God's wisdom was kind of part of his creative power. And because the New Testament writers seem to buy into this idea, I think we ought to as well, that not only is Jesus the word that God spoke to create the universe, but God also created the universe out of his wisdom, this dividing between what is good and what is evil. Like it is all imbued in creation. So the animating, creating power of God, which is Jesus, and his wisdom comes together to create life and reality itself. The air in your lungs is in your lungs because God spoke. And because God flexed his wisdom, you have blood running through your veins and thoughts in your head. So that is all part of what we mean when we use the word God. Now, as John continues, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, a little confusing. He means John the Baptist, not John the writer. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. So John, the writer, is very careful to point out that John the Baptist is not the Messiah. And that seems to be because John the Baptist was an enormously popular figure in the first century. He shows up in other Jewish writing. So he's trying to make sure everyone's clear on that. But this John the Baptist, is described by Jesus as like the last of the great prophets. And John the Baptizer, he sounds like the great prophets. He, as Jesus says, he is Elijah, who has come to prepare the way. Elijah is one of the earliest of the great prophets. And what I think we ought to kind of get from this as we're answering the question, what do we mean when we say the word God? Is that just as John the Baptist is part of this ongoing history and story of God's people, that God is invested in humanity through story and history. God is not a concept. He is not a philosophy. He is not this disembodied kind of floaty thing that we sort of grab by pure logic and reason, but rather God gets his hands dirty and involved. The story of God and the way we know God is through the history of humanity and through the stories that his people have told. They kind of all wind their way in and through John the Baptist and then on to Jesus. And then he continues, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. So John is mixing his metaphors here. Jesus is the word that was spoken to create the universe, like this, and therefore like this wisdom and this all manifest as flesh. But Jesus is also this true light that tells us how things really are. That true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So Jesus, this wisdom, this word, this creating energy of God, came into this world as flesh. He became a human. He was born of a woman. This is what we mean when we use the word incarnation. Incarnation comes from a Latin phrase, and we'll break it down. In, meaning in, and carne, what does carne mean? I can't hear. Flesh, meat. Yeah, it is the in-meetment or the in-meeting of God. It is divinity walking around with eyelashes and flesh and blood and bones and muscle. He wears sandals. He wakes up. He goes to sleep. He eats. The word that was spoken to create the universe, God's divine wisdom, is now in creation itself to repair the disruption of God's created human beings who have perverted wisdom. We have gone off and decided that we know what is right and wrong. And that disruption in creation is now going to be confronted by wisdom itself, God's own wisdom, the word he spoke to create the universe, now written into human history and taking part in the old stories. But if you see at the end there, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him, which means that one of the things we mean when we use the word God is that God does not shy away from tragedy and irony and sadness. Jesus' own people, the family of Israel, descended from Abraham, the people who were given the gift of God's Torah, his law, did not see him. So God, whatever we mean by that, is a God who creates, a God who is invested in creation, a God who uses this word that he was spoken, which is also his son, which is also him, and that's very confusing. His manifest wisdom is like this energy or this power by which he creates, and he has written himself into story and through history, that he inserts himself into tragedy and sadness and irony. And then as John continues, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. So God has a family. And he started this family in a weird way, first with this man and this woman in the garden, but then more officially in Abraham. And he said, you and your family, you will be my people and I will be your God. And God has then worked through this holy family his repair, his rescue of the disruption of wisdom that occurred so long ago. But there's a catch. His family is messed up. They are complicated. They are called to be the solution to the problem, and they are very often part of the problem themselves. And the reason why I think that is important is that this is Christmas time. This is when we gather as a family. And I like to point out every year, just so everyone knows that this is normal and we all deal with this, that yesterday, December 21st, is the shortest day of the year based on daylight. And then the longest day of the year is now 3 days from today, when we have to spend Christmas with our family all day. And every single service that I've mentioned that to, you see people nodding and people elbowing, and because you get it. Because family can be complicated and tricky and sometimes painful. And God has a family, and that family is no different. But he gave the right for those who believe, that's like you and me, the right to become children of God. So families have usually like really hard borders or boundaries. Like, you can't join my family. Now, my family, like, we tend to be like, well, everyone's sort of family if we get to know you and all of that. So there is that sense. But from a legal and technical point of view, you cannot join my family. The only way you could join my family is if you have a daughter who's like age 6 to 8 years old, and then we'll arrange a marriage with my son or something like that. But there's a very hard vetting process, I will warn you. But God's family is porous and open. Anybody can be part of God's family. And even more so, God is actively hunting people down to bring them, even if it means kicking and screaming, into this family. How do I know that? Because his own son, the word spoken to create the universe, divine wisdom incarnate, came into a very messy and disrupted world to do exactly that. And you and me sitting here today are living proof, because we are now children born into God's family. Because in that messiness of life, that as Jesus entered into all of these swirling stories, he also took on our mortality and all of human sin, and our use of power and force and influence swirled around, and it eventually came concentrated onto Jesus, and it cost him his life. And when God raised him from the dead 3 days later, he defeated that one foe that we cannot. Death itself was reversed and transformed into something new. That is also what we mean when we use the word God. And then finally we come to chapter 1, verse 14 of the book of John. This, and I will go to the mat for it, is the most important verse in the Bible, because in this verse is the entire story of God brought together. The Word, Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In Greek, that word for dwell is skenao, and it is the word that refers to God's tabernacle, the ancient sacred tabernacle of Israel, where God's very presence comes. When Jesus hits the scene, God's presence, started at creation, has finally returned. And from then on, God is active and bringing more and more people through these porous boundaries of his family, that they might know the grace that he brings through his death and resurrection, and the truth of who he really is. That is what we mean when we use the word God. Let's pray.